The year was 1861, and the air in the Iowa hills was thick with the scent of a coming war, a distant storm that felt both ominous and strangely irrelevant to Elara's current plight. The world was on the brink of tearing itself apart, yet here she was, her small world already shattered. Her husband, Silas, was dead. Not from some soldier's bullet, but from a sudden violent fever that had swept through his body like a wildfire, leaving him a cold, still effigy in their lonely, sprawling hotel. The hotel itself, an imposing structure of dark wood and stone, was a monument to Silas's ambition. He had built it on a secluded stretch of the old stagecoach route, a place where weary travelers sought refuge from the desolate landscape. It was a handsome building, full of heavy furniture and the lingering smell of pipe smoke and damp earth. But to Elara, it felt more like a prison than a home. The floorboards groaned with every step, the wind howled through the eaves like a mournful spirit, and the silence was a living, breathing thing that pressed in on her from all sides. She sat in the parlor, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The official diagnosis was fever, but Elara couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Silas had been a man of robust health, a sturdy oak that nothing could topple. The fever had taken him in a matter of days, his final moments spent in a delirious state, his last words a fragmented guttural whisper about the kitchen. He had thrashed in his bed, his eyes wide with a terror Elara had never seen before, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to push away some unseen horror. The kitchen. It was the heart of the hotel, the place where all the food was prepared for the travelers. And it was the one place Silas had always been fiercely protective of, forbidding her from entering, even to help with the most trivial tasks. "It's my domain, Elara," he would say, his tone sharp and final. "You handle the guests, I'll handle the food." Now, she was the one who had to handle everything. The guests were starting to arrive, their faces etched with the fatigue of a long journey. The first was a man named Mr. Finch, a traveling salesman with a perpetually anxious expression and a worn leather satchel. The second was a young, quiet woman who went by the name of Amelia, her eyes dark and haunted. Elara felt the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. The hotel was her only inheritance, her only way to survive. But how could she run a business she barely understood, especially one with a kitchen that felt like a tomb? She had to find a way to get food to the guests, but the thought of entering that room filled her with a profound dread. She felt Silas's presence there, a cold, suffocating weight. The next morning, driven by a desperate need to provide for her guests and an even more potent curiosity, Elara decided to brave the kitchen. She gripped the brass doorknob, her hand trembling. The air on the other side was cold, stale, and smelled of something she couldn't quite place. A mixture of old spices, burnt oil, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. The room was large, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove and a long wooden counter. A single grimy window looked out onto the bleak, grey landscape. As she moved deeper into the room, she noticed something peculiar. The floorboards in the center of the kitchen were stained dark, almost black, and the stains seemed to be impossibly deep, as if the wood had been soaked in some dark liquid for years. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the outline of the stain. It was cold and slick to the touch, and she swore she could feel a faint, clammy residue on her fingertips. Suddenly, a loud rap on the front door startled her. She jumped to her feet, her hand instinctively going to her mouth to stifle a cry. She hurried out of the kitchen, pulling the door shut behind her. She opened the front door to find two men standing on the porch. One was a tall, angular man with a sharp, inquisitive gaze and a neatly trimmed beard. The other was a younger man, with a kind face and a medical bag clutched in his hand. "Mrs. Wallace?" the taller man asked, his voice a low rumble. "My name is Detective Silas Thorne. This is Dr. Alistair Finch. We're investigating the recent spate of disappearances in this area. Elara's blood ran cold. Disappearances. The word echoed in her mind, a new layer of dread added to her already heavy burden. She remembered the whispered stories from the few travelers who had passed through before Silas's death. Tales of people who had set out on the road to the hotel but had never arrived, their trails simply vanishing into thin air. The detective's gaze was unsettlingly intense, as if he could see right through her. "Your husband's death was sudden," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "And we've received reports that he was the last person to see a number of missing individuals. We need to ask you some questions." Elara's world, already a fractured landscape of grief and fear, was now filled with a new, terrifying uncertainty. The kitchen, the disappearances, the detective's unsettling stare. It was all a puzzle, and she was the only one left to put the pieces together. But as she looked at the detective and the doctor, she realized she wasn't alone. And she had a terrible feeling they were all about to uncover a truth far more sinister than any fever. Detective Thorne's questions were like daggers, each one a new probe into Elara's shattered life. He sat in the parlor, his gaze sweeping over the room as if searching for a hidden clue in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of quiet observation, stood by the fireplace, his eyes downcast, but his attention was clearly fixed on their conversation. "So, you say your husband, Silas, was a man of routine, Mrs. Wallace?" Thorne asked, his voice a low, steady hum. Elara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Yes, he was meticulous. Every day was the same. He'd wake early, prepare the kitchen for the day's meals, and then he'd handle the guests. "And you never went into the kitchen?" "No," Elara replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Silas was protective of it. He said it was his domain. He even did all the cleaning." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "That's peculiar. A man of his stature, doing all the grunt work himself?" "He said he had a system," Elara said, her memory of Silas's sharp reprimands vivid in her mind. He didn't want anyone interfering with his methods. Thorne leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Did you ever hear anything unusual coming from the kitchen? Any strange noises, any smells?" Elara hesitated, a memory resurfacing. "There was a smell, sometimes, a kind of earthy, metallic scent. I just thought it was the old stove." Alistair Finch spoke for the first time, his voice soft but clear. "That's a common smell in old kitchens, Detective. It could be rust, or perhaps some of the iron fittings." Thorne nodded but didn't take his eyes off Elara. "And the disappearances, Mrs. Wallace? Mr. O'Malley, the peddler who was last seen here 3 months ago. The travelling merchant, Mr. Sterling, 2 months before that." Elara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "Silas. He said they left, that they just packed up and went on their way. Did he seem concerned at all?" "No," she said, her voice shaking. "He was unbothered. He said the road was a dangerous place and people often changed their minds about their destination." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Thorne rose to his feet, walking towards the window and staring out at the desolate landscape. "We have reason to believe that these people didn't just disappear, Mrs. Wallace. We think something happened to them." Elara's heart pounded. She glanced at Dr. Finch, who met her gaze with a look of quiet sympathy. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in facts. But there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps, or a deep-seated suspicion. "What do you need from me?" Elara asked, her voice more steady now, a new resolve hardening her core. She had to find out what was going on, not just for herself, but for the memory of the husband she thought she knew. "We need to see the kitchen, Mrs. Wallace," Thorne said, turning back to face her. We need to see where your husband conducted his work." Elara's blood ran cold. She had to let them in. She had no choice. She led them down the long, dark hallway, the floorboards groaning under their combined weight. The air grew colder as they approached the kitchen door. She could feel the lingering chill from the room, even through the thick wood. She opened the door, and the metallic, sickly, sweet smell hit them all at once. Thorne's sharp nose wrinkled, and even Dr. Finch took a step back. "What is that smell?" the doctor muttered, his hand going to his face. I told you," Elara said, her voice trembling. "I don't know." Thorne stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the large stove, the worn wooden counters, the hanging pots and pans. He stopped in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the dark, impossibly deep stain on the floorboards. He knelt down, his fingers gently touching the surface. He looked at Elara, a new, chilling intensity in his eyes. "Mrs. Wallace," he said, his voice low and serious, "this isn't a stain from old oil or spilled coffee. This is blood." The word hung in the air, a final, horrifying truth that confirmed all of Elara's darkest fears. Silas hadn't just been protective of his kitchen, he had been hiding something terrible. The disappearances, his strange behavior, the smell, the stain, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. Her husband wasn't the man she thought he was. He was a monster. As the detective stood up, his gaze sweeping over the room with renewed purpose, Elara's mind raced. She had to protect herself, but more importantly, she had to find out the truth. She had to know what happened in this room, and she had a terrible feeling that the truth was far worse than she could ever imagine. The silence of the lost now had a voice, and it was whispering to her from the depths of the cursed kitchen. The word blood hung in the air, a grim pronouncement that settled over the kitchen like a shroud. Elara's knees felt weak, and she leaned against the doorframe for support, her mind reeling. The man she had loved, the man she had promised to spend her life with, was a killer. The thought was as surreal as it was horrifying. Detective Thorne, however, was a man of action, not of emotion. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and began to scribble, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. Dr. Finch, his scientific curiosity overcoming his initial revulsion, moved closer to the stain, his gaze scrutinizing the floorboards. "It appears to have been here for some time," Dr. Finch said, his voice professional and detached. "The wood has absorbed it, but what bothers me is the lack of any discernible spatter." "What do you mean?" Elara asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "If this was a scene of violence, there would be more evidence," he explained, gesturing around the room. "Blood doesn't just pool. There would be splashes, drips, some sign of a struggle." Thorne looked up from his notebook. "He was meticulous, Mrs. Wallace. You said so yourself. He had a system. He would have cleaned up after himself." "But why?" Elara's voice was filled with a desperate need for understanding. Why would he do this? What was his motive? Thorne's gaze softened for a moment, a brief flicker of empathy in his sharp eyes. "That's what we need to find out, Mrs. Wallace. We need to understand your husband's system. What did he do here, and how did he do it without anyone knowing?" He turned his attention to the large cast-iron stove. It was a beast of a thing, its black surface scuffed and grimy, but its presence was intimidating. Thorne ran his hand along its side, feeling the cold, rough metal. "This is the heart of the kitchen," he mused. "The heat source. The place where the magic happens, so to speak." Elara's mind, still in a state of shock, began to put together the pieces. Silas had always kept the stove burning, even on the hottest of days. He said it was to keep the food warm for the travelers, but now she wondered if it was for another, more sinister purpose. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, was examining a large iron pot that sat on the counter. "This is unusual," he said, his brow furrowed. "It's far too large for a regular meal, and it's impossibly clean, almost as if it has been scoured recently." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She remembered Silas polishing the pot with a frightening intensity, his face a mask of concentration. He said it was to prevent rust, but now she saw it for what it was, an act of obsessive cleanliness, a way to erase all traces of his monstrous work. Thorne moved to the large wooden counter, his fingers tracing the faint lines and grooves in the wood. He found a small, almost imperceptible latch on the side of the counter. He pressed it, and a small hidden drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside, there was a single, leather-bound journal. Elara gasped. She had never seen this journal before. Silas had kept his personal writings under lock and key, a private world she was never allowed to enter. Thorne pulled out the journal and began to flip through the pages. The handwriting was Silas's, and the entries were meticulous, detailed accounts of his daily life, the weather, the guests, and the cooking. But as Thorne read on, the entries became more cryptic, more disturbing. "The water is boiling. The steam fills the room. A new recipe, a new flavor. The meat is tender." The traveler from the east. He was a difficult man. He had a sharp tongue, but he will provide sustenance for the next few days. The taste of revenge is surprisingly sweet. Elara's breath hitched in her throat. The entries weren't about food at all. They were about the travelers, and the meat, the taste of revenge. A nauseating thought began to form in her mind, a monstrous truth that was too terrible to be real. "My God," Dr. Finch whispered, his face pale. He wasn't just killing them, he was boiling them. Thorne's face was grim, and he was serving them to the other guests. He was serving them to you, Mrs. Wallace. Elara's world tilted on its axis. The food she had eaten, the meals she had shared with Silas, the savory stews and hearty roasts, they were all made from the flesh of his victims. The knowledge was a physical blow, a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. "He used the stove to boil the bodies," Thorne continued, his voice low and detached, as if he were discussing a scientific theory. "The large pot to contain them, and the journal, a sick, twisted record of his gruesome work. He was a collector of lives, a ghost in the machine, and no one ever knew." Elara felt the room begin to spin. The silence of the house, the echoing corridors, the smell of the kitchen, it all took on a new, horrifying meaning. Her husband hadn't died of a fever. He had been taken by the weight of his own monstrous deeds, consumed by the very darkness he had created. As she looked at the detective and the doctor, a new fear began to gnaw at her. What other secrets did this hotel hold? And what would she have to do to uncover them all? The truth was a living thing, and it was about to reveal itself in the most terrifying way imaginable. The chilling revelation of Silas's journal, his gruesome recipes for human flesh, hung in the air like a thick, foul vapor. Elara felt a wave of profound nausea, a visceral rejection of the reality that was now hers. The man she had loved was a cannibalistic killer, and she had been living and eating under the same roof as his monstrous crimes. Dr. Finch, his face a mask of professional horror, had stepped back from the stove, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a visible unease. Detective Thorne, however, was a man unfazed by the macabre. He continued to read from the journal, his voice a low monotone, each word a new, soul-crushing detail. He read an entry about a traveling salesman, a man who complained about the lack of variety in his meals. Silas had remedied the situation, writing, "His complaints have been silenced. His essence is now a part of the daily offering. He will never complain again." Elara couldn't bear to hear any more. She stumbled out of the kitchen and into the cold, oppressive silence of the hallway, her mind a whirlwind of torment. She found herself in the parlor, collapsing onto the worn velvet sofa, the familiar comfort of the room now a mockery of what her life had once been. Thorne and Dr. Finch followed her, their footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. "Mrs. Wallace, we have to ask you some more questions," Thorne said, his voice softer now, a hint of concern in his tone. "We need to understand how he was doing this. He couldn't have been boiling entire bodies in that pot. It's not large enough." Elara, her eyes glazed with tears, shook her head. "I don't know. He kept me out of the kitchen." "What about the other guests?" Dr. Finch asked, his voice gentle. "Did anyone ever complain about the food or the smell?" She tried to think, her mind a blank slate. "No. The travelers were always grateful for a warm meal. They were tired, hungry. They weren't looking for a gourmet dinner." Thorne paced the room, his mind working furiously. There must be a way to dispose of the rest of the body. He couldn't just leave it. The stench would have been unbearable. A cold thought pierced Elara's despair. The garden. He was obsessed with the garden. He said he was preparing the soil for a new harvest. Thorne's eyes lit up with a grim realization. He strode to the window, looking out at the barren patch of earth behind the hotel. That's it. He was burying the remains in the garden. He was using the soil to hide his crimes. The thought of her husband tending to a garden of human remains was a final, devastating blow. She felt a new kind of terror, a visceral horror that transcended her grief. She was living in a house built on death, a monument to a man's sick and twisted obsession. "We need to check the garden," Thorne said to Dr. Finch, his voice tight with anticipation. "We need to find the bodies." As they made their way outside, Elara noticed something she had never paid attention to before. There were several patches of freshly tilled earth, each one marked by a small wooden cross, as if they were graves. But graves for what? Thorne knelt down, his fingers digging into the soft earth. He pulled out a small piece of cloth, a button, and a shard of bone. "It's a burial ground," he said, his voice low and serious. He wasn't preparing the soil for a harvest. He was burying the evidence, but these aren't full bodies. He was breaking them down. Dr. Finch, ever the man of science, examined the bone shard. "This is a clean break," he said, his voice filled with a professional curiosity that was chilling. "It's not a natural break. It's as if he used a tool to break the bones. And the cloth. It's a piece of a man's coat. A traveling man's coat." Elara's mind raced. The missing travelers, the gruesome journal entries, the macabre garden. It all came together in a horrifying picture of a man's descent into madness. But there was still a missing piece. Why? Why would he do this? "We need to go back inside," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on Elara. "We need to find out what turned your husband into a monster. This wasn't just a random act of madness. There's a motive here. A sick, twisted motive, but a motive nonetheless." They returned to the hotel, the air inside now feeling even more suffocating. Thorne went to the kitchen and began to methodically search the room, his hands moving with the precision of a trained investigator. He checked under the counters, in the cupboards, and in the dark corners of the pantry. He found it under the large iron stove, a small hidden compartment, barely noticeable to the naked eye. He pried it open, and inside there was a stack of old, worn letters. Elara gasped. They were her letters. Letters she had written to her husband during his long absences. But these weren't just letters. They were her confessions of love, of fear, of her desperate need for his return. Thorne read one of the letters aloud, his voice low and solemn. "My dearest Silas, the nights are so long without you. I fear I may not be able to bear this loneliness much longer. I miss you so. Please, come back to me soon." Elara's heart ached. She had poured her soul into those letters, a lonely wife pleading for her husband's return. But now they felt like a cruel joke, a testament to her naivety. Thorne pulled out another letter, his face grim. This one is different. It's addressed to a different man, a man named Arthur. Elara's blood ran cold. Arthur. He was a local farmer, a kind man who had been a good friend to her during Silas's long absences. He had been a source of comfort, a shoulder to cry on. But their relationship had been purely platonic, or so she had thought. Thorne's eyes met hers. He was reading your letters, Mrs. Wallace, all of them, and he was marking them. He was keeping track of your interactions with other men. He was jealous. He was watching you, even from a distance. The letters were his way of keeping you under his control. Elara felt a new kind of terror, a cold, suffocating fear. The disappearances, the gruesome meals, the morbid garden, it all stemmed from her. Her husband's monstrous acts were a result of his obsessive, paranoid jealousy. He wasn't just killing strangers, he was punishing them for being near her. He was a possessive ghost, and she was his prisoner. The kitchen wasn't just a place of death, it was a monument to his twisted love, a place where he could exert his control over her, even in his final moments. The realization that Silas's monstrous acts were rooted in a twisted, possessive jealousy was a new kind of torment for Elara. She had been a ghost in her own life, a pawn in her husband's morbid game, and she hadn't even known it. The letters, her own words twisted into a grotesque justification for murder, felt like a personal betrayal. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, was already piecing together the puzzle. He wasn't just killing them for your supposed infidelity, he said, his voice low and serious. He was punishing them. He was using them as a way to send you a message that you belonged to him and him alone. Dr. Finch, his face still pale from the discovery of the journal, chimed in. It's a psychological condition, a form of extreme possessive jealousy that leads to violent obsessive behavior. He saw every man who spoke to you as a threat, a rival to be eliminated. Elara felt a new kind of dread. The man she had thought she knew, the man she had grieved for, was a stranger, a monster, and she was a living, breathing part of his crime. She was the reason the travelers had died. There's something else, Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. In the journal, a different handwriting. It's a note. It says, "The doctor knows, the game is over." Elara's eyes darted to Dr. Finch. His face, usually so kind and professional, was now a mask of fear. His hands, which had been so steady, were now trembling slightly. "Alistair," Elara said, her voice filled with a chilling suspicion. "What do you know?" "Doctor." Finch looked at the ground, his gaze avoiding hers. I knew. I had my suspicions, but I couldn't prove it." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "What did you suspect, Dr. Finch? And why didn't you say anything?" Dr. Finch took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I was his doctor. I saw him frequently. He was a man of robust health, but he suffered from a mental illness, a paranoia that he kept hidden from everyone, even from me." "What kind of paranoia?" Thorne pressed. "He was convinced that his wife was going to leave him," Dr. Finch said, his voice a low whisper. "He was obsessed with it. He would talk about it constantly, his voice filled with a desperate, frantic fear. I prescribed him some laudanum to calm his nerves, but it only made him more agitated. I warned him that his mental state was a danger to himself and to others." "And what about the disappearances?" Thorne asked. "Did you suspect he was behind them?" Dr. Finch nodded, his eyes filled with a profound guilt. "I saw him the day after Mr. O'Malley disappeared. He was in a state of manic euphoria. He said, 'The threat has been eliminated, Alistair. My wife is safe now.' I didn't connect it at the time. I thought he was just rambling." Elara felt a cold rage bubbling up inside her. Dr. Finch had known. He had suspected her husband was a monster, and he had done nothing. He had let her live with a killer, a man who was using her as a sick justification for his crimes. "You let him get away with it," she said, her voice filled with a venomous fury. "You let him kill those people." Dr. Finch looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate remorse. "I didn't know for sure, Elara. I just had my suspicions, and I was afraid. Silas was a powerful, influential man. I was a young, struggling doctor. I had a family to protect." Thorne, his gaze now fixed on Dr. Finch, spoke, his voice hard and uncompromising. "You withheld information from the authorities, Doctor. That's a crime. And now, thanks to your silence, more people may have been killed." The doctor's head hung low. "I know, and I will bear the weight of that guilt for the rest of my life." The truth was a tangled web of deception and betrayal. Silas had been a monster, and Dr. Finch had been his accomplice in silence. Elara felt a new kind of despair. She wasn't just a victim. She was a participant in this gruesome tragedy, a part of a sick and twisted game she had never known she was playing. But the note in the journal still bothered her. "The doctor knows. The game is over." It was a warning, a final cryptic message from a dying man. What did it mean? What was the game? Was there something more to this story, something they hadn't uncovered yet? As she looked at the two men in her parlor, one a haunted investigator and the other a guilt-ridden doctor, Elara knew she had to find out. She had to uncover the whole truth, no matter how painful, no matter how terrifying. She had to understand the full extent of the monster her husband had become and the people who had allowed him to get away with it. Her journey into the darkness had only just begun, and the truth was waiting for her in the shadows. The cold, hard truth of Dr. Finch's complicity hung in the air, a final, damning piece of the puzzle. Elara's initial rage was now replaced by a chilling sense of betrayal. The men around her, the very people she thought she could trust, were all intertwined in this horrific web of secrets and lies. She was a pawn in a game she hadn't known she was playing, a game that had been meticulously designed by a man she had loved and lost. Detective Thorne, his suspicions confirmed, now turned his focus back to the journal. "He wrote this note after he was already ill," Thorne said, his eyes scanning the page. "It's a warning. He knew he was dying, and he knew Finch knew. He was trying to protect his secret, even in death." "But why would he care if Finch knew?" Elara asked, her voice still trembling with the weight of her new reality. "He was dying. The game was already over for him. Because he wanted to control the narrative," Thorne replied, his voice a low rumble. "He wanted to be the architect of his own chaos, even from beyond the grave. He wanted to ensure that his gruesome work would never be fully understood, that his motive would remain a mystery." Alistair Finch, his head still bowed in shame, finally looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "He was a master manipulator, Elara. He made me feel like I was the only person who could understand his condition. He convinced me that I was helping him by keeping his secret. He was a madman, but a brilliant one." Elara's mind raced. The man she had known as her husband, a kind, if a little distant man, was now revealed to be a twisted, paranoid genius, a man who had built a monument to his own madness. She had been living with a monster, and she hadn't even known it. "The journal," Elara said, her mind suddenly clear. "He wrote about the travelers, the peddler, Mr. O'Malley, the merchant, Mr. Sterling, but he also wrote about others, travelers who had stayed at the hotel and left." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Elara said, her voice growing stronger, "that not all of the travelers who stayed here disappeared. Some of them left, so he wasn't killing everyone who came through the door. There must have been a pattern, a reason why he chose his victims. Thorne returned to the kitchen, his gaze now fixed on the old guest book that sat on a small table by the door. He was keeping track of them, he said, flipping through the pages, the names, the dates of their stay, where they were from. He was choosing them based on something specific. Elara and Dr. Finch followed him, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The guest book was a grim testament to Silas's meticulous nature. Each name was written in his neat, precise hand. But there was something else. A small, almost imperceptible symbol next to certain names. A tiny, hand-drawn star. "The stars," Elara whispered, her hand trembling as she pointed to the pages. He marked them. He was marking his victims. Thorne and Finch leaned in, their eyes scanning the pages. They found it. The names of the missing travelers, O'Malley and Sterling, each had a star next to them. But there were others. Several other names, all with the same sinister symbol. "He killed more than just the two we knew about," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "He was a serial killer. He was luring these people here and then he was murdering them." Elara's heart pounded. She had been a ghost in her own house, living among the ghosts of her husband's victims. The thought was unbearable. But why the stars? What did they mean? Elara's mind raced, trying to find a connection, a pattern. "The peddler," she said, her voice a desperate whisper. He was a talkative man. He spoke of his family, his wife, his children. "And the merchant, Dr. Finch added. "He was a handsome man, and he was known for being charming. He was a flirt." Thorne's eyes lit up with a grim understanding. He wasn't choosing them based on their physical attributes. He was choosing them based on their relationships. The peddler had a family. The merchant was a flirt. They were men who had something he didn't. They were men who had lives, loves, and connections. He was a jealous man, Elara. He was punishing them for having what he thought he couldn't have. He was punishing them for being happy. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Silas's paranoia wasn't just about Elara. It was about his own loneliness, his own inability to form genuine connections with others. He had become a monster not because of Elara, but because of his own twisted, broken psyche. She was just the catalyst, the excuse he used to justify his heinous crimes. The truth was a cold, hard slap in the face. She hadn't been the cause of his madness, but she had been the reason for his murders. And now, she was the only one left to clean up the mess he had left behind. "We need to find the other victims," Thorne said, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "We need to find out who they were, and we need to give them a proper burial." Elara nodded, a new resolve hardening her gaze. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And she would not rest until she had uncovered every last one of Silas's gruesome secrets and ensured that the souls of his victims finally found peace. The architect of chaos had met his end, but his work was far from over. With a new, chilling purpose, Elara, Thorne, and Finch began the painstaking task of unearthing Silas's gruesome secrets. The guest book, marked with its grim constellations of stars, was their map. Each star was a life taken, a traveler who had sought refuge in the hotel and found only a final, horrifying end. The three of them worked in a grim, silent rhythm, digging in the freshly tilled soil of the garden, a place that now felt less like a patch of earth and more like a mass grave. The work was physically and emotionally draining. They found the remains of 6 other travelers, each one a testament to Silas's meticulous brutality. The bodies were dismembered, their bones broken, and their possessions scattered among the soil. The discovery of each new victim was a new blow to Elara's already fractured psyche. She found a worn leather wallet, A silver locket with a faded picture of a young woman, a child's toy soldier, each item a painful reminder of the lives that had been snuffed out by the man she had loved. Thorne, his face grim and determined, meticulously documented each find. He was a collector, he said, his voice low and serious. He kept their belongings, a gruesome trophy for each life he took. He was reliving the moment of their deaths over and over again. Dr. Finch, his medical expertise now a grim tool for forensics, examined each set of remains, his gaze filled with a somber reverence. "He was a monster, Elara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He was driven by a madness that I, as a doctor, cannot even begin to comprehend." Elara, however, was no longer consumed by grief or self-pity. A new emotion had taken hold, a burning, all-consuming need for understanding. She needed to know why. Why her? Why the letters? Why the stars? There was a deeper truth here, a root cause that went beyond simple jealousy. She returned to the hotel, leaving the two men to their grim work. She went to the library, a room filled with Silas's books. He had been a collector of rare books, and the shelves were filled with leather-bound volumes on history, philosophy, and the sciences. But as she ran her hand along the spines, she found a book that felt different. It was old, its leather cover worn and cracked, and it had a strange, almost mystical symbol on its cover. She pulled it out, and as she did, a small piece of paper fell to the floor. She picked it up and opened it. It was a newspaper clipping, old and yellowed with age. The headline was a grim one. "Tragedy in the West. Family of 5 found dead in a hotel kitchen." Elara's blood ran cold. The article detailed the story of a family, a husband, a wife, and their 3 children, who had been found dead in the kitchen of a hotel in the western United States. The cause of death was poisoning, and the perpetrator, a jealous, deranged cook, had died in the same room. The article ended with a haunting sentence. "The kitchen is a place of nourishment, but for this family, it was a place of death, a cursed place where their lives were taken in a final, horrifying act of malice." She read on, her eyes scanning the small, faded text. The name of the cook was Silas Wallace. Elara's world tilted on its axis. Her husband, the man she had loved, was not the Silas Wallace who had died in this hotel. He was a different man, a different monster. The Silas Wallace she had known was a killer who had taken the name and the story of another killer and used it as his own. She ran back outside, her hands trembling, the newspaper clipping clutched in her hand. "Thorne!" she yelled, her voice a frantic cry. "Finch, you won't believe this." Thorne and Finch, their hands covered in dirt, looked up, their faces etched with concern. Elara showed them the clipping, her voice a frantic whisper as she explained the truth. "He wasn't Silas Wallace," she said, her voice filled with a desperate clarity. "He was another man, a man who took the name of a killer. He was living out the story of another man's crimes, a twisted, macabre tribute to a monster he admired." Thorne took the clipping, his eyes scanning the page with a grim fascination. "It makes sense," he said, his voice low and serious. "He was living a lie. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who had taken the identity of another and used it to justify his own heinous acts." Dr. Finch, his face a mixture of shock and understanding, took the clipping from Thorne. "He was obsessed with the idea of a cursed kitchen," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of dread. "He wasn't just a killer, he was a disciple of a killer. He was recreating a crime that had already been committed, a crime he saw as a work of art." The truth was a final, devastating blow. The man Elara had loved was not only a monster but a fraud, a man who had stolen the identity of another killer and used it to live out his own gruesome fantasies. Her life had been a lie, her love a tool for a madman's obsession. But now, with the truth finally unveiled, she had a new sense of purpose. She would not let his story end here. She would ensure that his victims and the true Silas Wallace were not forgotten. She would expose his lies and his crimes, and she would bring his twisted tale to a final, permanent end. The truth, once a suffocating weight, now felt like a liberation. Elara stood in the ruins of her life, the old, yellowed newspaper clipping a testament to the lie she had lived. The man she had known as Silas Wallace was a different man altogether, a twisted shadow of another's crime. He had not just been a killer. He had been an imposter, a man so consumed by a gruesome story that he had adopted its identity. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, saw the new layer of the puzzle as a way to bring a final, permanent end to the mystery. "We need to find out who he really was," he said, his eyes scanning the clipping for any new clues. "We need to find his real identity, his real past. That's the only way we can put an end to this." Elara, however, felt a different urgency. "He wrote about the kitchen," she said, her voice a whisper, "as a cursed place. He saw it as a work of art, the guest book, the journal, the garden. They were all part of his twisted masterpiece. He was trying to recreate the crime he had read about, to live out a gruesome fantasy." Dr. Finch, his scientific mind now grappling with a new kind of madness, nodded in agreement. "He wasn't just a man with a mental illness," he said, his voice low and serious. "He was a man obsessed with a story. He was a disciple of a killer, a follower of a macabre cult of one. His paranoia wasn't just about you, Elara. It was about his own failure to live up to the standard of the man he was pretending to be." The three of them returned to the hotel, the air inside now feeling even more suffocating. They scoured the house, looking for any sign of the true identity of the man they had known as Silas Wallace. They found nothing. No letters, no photographs, no personal belongings that could link him to another life. It was as if he had been born in this hotel, a ghost in the machine, and had never existed before. Elara, however, had an idea. "His name," she said, her mind racing. "He must have had a name, a real name. He had to have a past, a life before this." Thorne looked at her, his brow furrowed. "We've searched the whole house, Elara. There's nothing." "But what about his books?" she said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "He was a collector of rare books. What if he hid something in one of them? A secret compartment, a hidden note, something that could reveal his true identity." They went to the library, a room that now felt like a crypt. They began to search the books, a painstaking task that felt like an impossible puzzle. But then, Elara found it. A book on ancient history, its cover worn and its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, and a small folded piece of paper fell to the floor. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a photograph. A faded, black-and-white picture of a young man, a handsome, smiling man with a kind face and a twinkle in his eye. He looked nothing like the man she had known as Silas Wallace. The man in the picture was a stranger, and on the back of the picture, in a neat, precise hand, was a name: Arthur Sterling. Elara's heart pounded. Arthur Sterling. He was the man who had been a good friend to her during Silas's long absences, the man she had written the letters to, the man Silas had been so jealous of. But he was more than that. He was the man in the picture, the man who had disappeared. Thorne, his eyes scanning the back of the photograph, looked at Elara, his face grim. "He didn't just kill him, Elara," he said, his voice a low whisper. "He killed him, and then he stole his identity. He became the man he was jealous of. He became Arthur Sterling." Elara felt a wave of profound despair. The man she had known as her husband, the man who had adopted the identity of a killer, was in fact Arthur Sterling. He had killed the real Silas Wallace, and then he had taken his name. He had lived out a sick, twisted fantasy, and she had been his unwitting accomplice. "The journal," Dr. Finch said, his face pale with shock. "He wrote about killing a man named Arthur. He didn't just kill him. He killed him and then he became him. He was a master manipulator, a man who had stolen the identity of his victim and used it to live out his own gruesome fantasies." The truth was a final, devastating blow. The man she had loved, the man she had grieved for, was a stranger, a ghost who had taken the name and the life of another. The hotel, her home, was a monument to his twisted fantasies, a place where he had lived out a monstrous lie. But now, with his real identity finally revealed, she had a new sense of purpose. She would not let his story end here. She would ensure that the souls of his victims finally found peace, and that the world would know the true story of the monster who had called himself Silas Wallace. The discovery that the man Elara had known as Silas Wallace was in fact Arthur Sterling, the man whose identity he had stolen, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The entire twisted narrative of jealousy, murder, and deception now coalesced into a single horrifying picture. The Silas Wallace Elara had loved was a fabrication, a gruesome construct built on lies and murder. He had not only killed men for their connections to her, but he had also killed the very man he was jealous of and taken his life. Elara's grief was now replaced by a chilling clarity. She had been married to a ghost, a man who had adopted the identity of his victim and used it to live out his monstrous fantasies. The letters she had written to Arthur Sterling, the letters that had fueled Silas's paranoia, were now a testament to her unwitting complicity. Thorne, his face grim and determined, took the photograph from Elara. "This changes everything," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to go to the authorities. We need to expose him. We need to tell them the truth." "But who would believe us?" Elara said, her voice filled with a new kind of fear. "We have no proof. We have a journal written by a man who is dead and a photograph of a man who is missing. We have nothing." "We have the bodies," Dr. Finch said, his voice filled with a grim determination. "We have the remains in the garden, and we have the witness statements from the travelers. We can prove that he was killing people, and with the photograph, we can prove that he wasn't who he said he was." Elara, however, felt a different kind of urgency. "He wrote about the kitchen as a cursed place," she said, her mind racing. "He saw it as a place of power, a place where he could control life and death. He was a man who had stolen the identity of a killer, and then he had lived out a macabre fantasy. We can't just leave it at that. We have to understand the full extent of his madness." She led them back to the kitchen, a place that now felt less like a room and more like a tomb. She looked at the cast-iron stove, the long wooden counter, the dark, blood-soaked floorboards. "He was a man who had no identity of his own," she said, her voice a whisper. "He had to steal one. He had to become someone else to feel alive. And he chose the identity of a killer, a man who had a story to tell. He was living out a gruesome fantasy, and we were all a part of it." Thorne, his gaze fixed on the stove, nodded slowly. "He wasn't just killing for jealousy, Elara. He was killing to live out a sick, twisted fantasy. He was a man with no identity, so he had to create one for himself. And he chose the identity of a monster." Dr. Finch, his face pale with shock, shook his head. "I never saw it," he said, his voice filled with a desperate remorse. "I saw a man who was paranoid, a man who was mentally ill, but I never saw a man who was living a lie. I never saw a man who had stolen the identity of his victim." The truth was a cold, hard slap in the face. The man they had known as Silas Wallace was a ghost, a man who had taken the name and the life of another and used it to live out his own twisted fantasies. The hotel, her home, was a monument to his lies, a place where he had lived out a monstrous lie. But now, with his real identity finally revealed, she had a new sense of purpose. She would not rest until she had uncovered every last one of his gruesome secrets and ensured that the souls of his victims finally found peace. "We need to find out where the real Silas Wallace is buried," Elara said, her voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "We need to give him a proper burial. We need to expose the truth, and we need to ensure that the man who stole his identity is not forgotten." They searched the property, a grim, silent search for the final piece of the puzzle. They found it in the small, neglected cemetery on the hill behind the hotel. A single, unmarked grave, its stone weathered and its inscription faded. They dug it up and they found a body. A man's body. And in his pocket, a small, faded picture of a young woman and a child. A picture of Elara and a young boy she had never seen before. Elara's blood ran cold. The man in the grave was the real Silas Wallace. And the woman and child in the picture were not her. They were his real family. The man she had loved, the man who had stolen the identity of a killer, had also stolen the identity of a family man. He had not only killed his victims, he had also killed the very idea of a family. The truth was a final, devastating blow. The man she had loved was a ghost, a man who had taken the name and the life of another and used it to live out his own twisted fantasies. But now, with the truth finally revealed, she had a new sense of purpose. She would not rest until she had uncovered every last one of his gruesome secrets and ensured that the souls of his victims finally found peace. The final truth was a brutal and cold reality. The man Elara had known as Silas Wallace was not a man driven by simple jealousy. He was an imposter, a ghost who had stolen the identity of a man he had murdered, a man with a family. The final discovery in the unmarked grave was a devastating blow, a final, horrifying truth that shattered the last remnants of Elara's life. The man she had loved, the man she had grieved for, was a phantom, a construct of lies and murder. With the truth laid bare, the three of them, Elara, Thorne, and Finch, felt a grim responsibility. They had to expose the imposter and give the real Silas Wallace a proper burial. They gathered the evidence, the journal, the photograph of Arthur Sterling, the newspaper clipping about the original crime, and the remains of the victims. They had a story to tell, a story so twisted and bizarre that it would be hard to believe. But they had the proof. Thorne went to the authorities, his voice a steady, unwavering drone as he laid out the gruesome story. He told them about the imposter, the stolen identity, the serial murders, and the motive. The authorities at first were skeptical, but then Thorne showed them the evidence, the journal, the photographs, the unearthed remains. The evidence was irrefutable. The story was a sensation. It was a tale of a man who had stolen the identity of a killer, and then a man with a family, and used them both to live out his own twisted fantasies. The story was a grim reminder that some monsters are not born, but made. Elara, her life shattered, found a new purpose. She decided to sell the hotel, a place that was now a monument to a madman's obsession. She used the money to build a memorial for the victims, a small stone monument on the hill behind the hotel. A monument to the forgotten, to the lost travelers who had sought refuge in a cursed place and had found only a final, horrifying end. Dr. Finch, his career in tatters, used his medical expertise to assist in the final, permanent end of the story. He wrote a book, a clinical and detached account of the psychological state of a man who had lived out a lie. The book was a grim warning, a testament to the dangers of a mind unhinged by paranoia and jealousy. Thorne, the man who had unraveled the whole mystery, found a new sense of purpose in his work. He became a detective who specialized in cold cases, a man who was obsessed with finding the truth no matter how grim. He and Elara became friends, their shared experience of a gruesome mystery, a bond that would last a lifetime. Elara, however, was not the same person. The woman who had lived a quiet, lonely life was now a woman who had faced the darkest corners of the human psyche and had survived. She left Iowa, a place that now felt like a prison. She found a new life, a new home, and a new purpose. She dedicated her life to helping others, to helping the victims of crimes, to ensuring that no one else would ever have to go through what she had. The hotel, a place that had once been a beacon of hope for weary travelers, was now a grim, silent monument. It stood on the hill, its windows like dark, empty eyes, a ghost of the past, a silent testament to the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The story of the cursed kitchen became a legend, a story whispered around campfires, a grim tale that was banned in history books. The story was a grim reminder that some monsters are not born, but made. They are made of lies, of secrets, of twisted fantasies, and of the lives of innocent people, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that are hiding in plain sight.